Okay, so welcome to the latest in our Somerford podcast series. This time we are blessed to have Tahir Latif with us today. Tahir is a Global Chief Privacy and AI Governance Officer for one of our partners at Somerford, Securiti.ai. Tahir, welcome.
Thank you, John. It's been a while.
Excellent. Well, we're here to talk about AI governance, and it's an area of increased exposure, increased uncertainty, lots of issues with organizations, DPOs or CPOs grappling with this. What's your perspective on the current state of AI governance?
AI governance is still very much in its infancy, John. There's, of course, there's the EU AI Act, which is now in force. And from February of this year, the prohibited systems were, already sort of effectively outlawed or enforceable. The challenge of AI governance is certainly huge, and it's more than just my colleagues and peers in the data privacy community, because it brings together a whole myriad of skill sets that are required. AI, by its very nature and definition, is both the human element, it's data, it's compute, it's algorithms, it's science, it's maths. So all of these have to come together, and all of these stakeholders are very much required to be part of the AI governance effort. Now, therein lies the challenge. Organizations are maturing, and the vast majority of my colleagues and peers, I always laugh and joke to them. I said, congratulations, you've all received an unpaid promotion. Because if you look at the world of data privacy now, you'll see data privacy officer and responsible for AI governance, or words to titles to that effect. The larger organizations, certainly in banking, healthcare, life sciences, a good few of my friends and colleagues are dedicated roles in AI governance only. Specifically within healthcare and life sciences, they use so much AI for the development of new drugs, for clinical trials, etc., that they got specialist departments there. But the challenges are multiple, in that if the onus is put on the data privacy department, they're lacking a lot of skill sets. We're experts in our domain.
Right.
We understand risks, but AI is much more than the current risks we understand. Yeah. We can start off with the actual, at the start of the life cycle, the risks to the data itself. We often, data privacy professionals, don't get involved in that data element. And AI needs huge amounts of data for it to ingest, to understand, to make those patterns and determinations. What kind of data is being ingested? So there we need expertise from our friends and colleagues in data. Then we need assistance on the actual maths itself, the science, the algorithm. Right? I'm not a scientist, I'm not technical, so I need to understand from my colleagues in data science and ML ops, how has this algorithm been developed? There's a famous quote, the author of which I can't remember now, but algorithms are merely our biases translated into code, right? That's what an algorithm is. If you're the developer,
sure,
whatever your biases are, of course, it's not done purposefully, but they will be put into the code. Now, what we're trying to achieve for AI governance is to have balanced, proportional, trustworthy, responsible, ethical AI.
Essentially guardrails. Is that what you're looking
Guardrails
at?
Across all of these different factors. Of course, the very important thing is only if these factors, John, are relevant. Because we can all throw out these terms that are lovely and warm and fuzzy, but they have to be relevant to your organization. So I also sit on the board of a not-for-profit, which is called the Ethical AI Alliance. And there we talk about, AI that is fit for humanity, AI that is fair and responsible for all globally, AI that can uplift all of humanity. So, of course, there we're looking exactly for the global definition, fair, responsible, ethical AI.
Sure.
But if you're in the business of building, mobile phones or motor vehicles, it's a means to an end.
Of course.
Yeah. Motor vehicle, perhaps it's not going to be unethical in the way it drives, right? You may deploy it to improve your manufacturing processes, to detect faults in your satellite navigation. But your sat nav is very rarely going to do or say something that's considered unethical. It may give you the wrong routing. Apart from that, so always deploy according to the use case. So we need a wide set of stakeholders. Therein lies the first challenge. How do you identify who the stakeholders are? And then, of course, getting crucially for that set of stakeholders, because it can't all be on the privacy team.
Yeah.
You need leadership, stakeholder buy-in, John.
Of course.
Right? You need that champion who, and there's plenty of them now. You know, a couple of years ago, there may have been far fewer, but AI is being deployed by just about every organization I know. And that direction is coming from leadership. It's coming from the top. Sometimes it's a sort of blanket statement. Utilize AI wherever you can, without much direction,
or without necessarily understanding the ramifications,
of course,
and the risks.
Right? Because the AI is being deployed for, it's being deployed for productivity gains, for streamlining, for efficiency, for increased revenue, decreasing costs. But depending upon the organization, as you've said, John, there'll be ramifications that may be very important. And it's better to build in those guardrails at the start of the process. Because after, for want of a better phrase, the genie's out of the bottle, it's very hard to bring the AI model back in and to put in all of those elements that we've talked about, right?
Yeah, I was interested there, just want to go back on what you said about pharma and health sciences, or life sciences, sorry, and the introduction of an ethical dimension to it all. I mean, and now clearly they are very concerned about that. I just wonder how have you seen that sort of play out? I mean, is it where it's played out, where it's gone really horribly wrong, or actually the ramifications of not necessarily considering the ethical dimension?
I'll give you a great example from last year. I was very fortunate to work with one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. I went over actually to do a week-long training exercise purely on AI governance, and they'd taken it very seriously. They'd flown in their global team into Switzerland. Team of about 50 or 70. That's how seriously they took it. It was a 1 week, effectively, a boot camp for risk and AI governance. And they had a multitude of challenges, and they had existing risk frameworks in place. They could have utilized those frameworks, and I think they were aligned with the ISO certification and framework, because it's a European company. But they decided that they had to build their own AI risk framework because, of course, the opportunities and the risks for how they were developing AI were so huge, but also potentially fraught with some kind of uncertainty and errors. The challenges they faced was all around the data, right? It was about the data, the type of data they had, and then very importantly, the variety of data. We have to talk about the 5 Vs, right? The 5 Vs of data, right? The velocity, the variety, the veracity, and a couple of others that I can't remember right now because you've got
volume.
Pressure. Yeah, the volume of data, absolutely, because AI needs huge volumes of data, right? Yeah. They had a volume of data, but they had the wrong types of data, John. And by that, what do I mean? Their data sets were typically for the clinical trials, and I'm sure you've seen these adverts, John. We need volunteers for a new clinical trial, and sometimes they go well, sometimes they go wrong. And I think was it in the UK? There was a horrible trial 5 to 7 years ago that really brought the dangers of clinical trials to the masses.
Sure,
where there was a trial undertaken and horrific side effects. Fortunately, I don't think there were any fatalities, but the side effects were certainly lifelong. Yeah. So the challenge they had was the data sets, and this call for volunteers was typically male white volunteers between the ages of 20 and 50. But you're trying to develop drugs and pharmaceuticals for all, right?
Yeah.
So when you're trying to develop something, using AI, which can only go on the data that it has, Of course, it can make relationships and patterns, and it can identify outliers. But what's essentially happening there is that we have an overfitting of data, very narrow data set, and they want to, develop a new drug for cancer that's global. Cancer doesn't discriminate.
No.
How can they do that? So they needed to go wider in terms of the data, and that was just one risk in terms of utilizing AI, right? And so then the decision was made well, how do we do that? We can't simply go and get data globally by asking for more volunteers and asking for their, to run clinical trials or their DNA or whatever.
Yeah.
So I gave them a really good solution. There's you can utilize synthetic data that can closely mirror the kind of data that you want and you need. So you put in the values of the kind of data you need, and then you can run synthetic data against that. Of course, it's all about the quality. I did highlight synthetic data is not all equal. Synthetic data is relatively new. It's an open source framework. It's available to everybody.
Okay.
But of course, there's always market leaders in this field, right? So choose the right kind of vendor and provider to give you the wide variety of data that you need to input into your models, and very closely monitor the output of the synthetic data against what you're trying to use. Ingest that into your model. It doesn't stop there. You continuously monitor the output such that, okay, if these were individuals from Africa or Southeast Asia or from the Far East or from APAC, does this output mirror the kind of results that we're expecting? Right? So that was one. There was a problem. It was a solution that we worked together in terms of jointly. But equally, within that group itself, it was a very diverse group. So they brought together diverse thinking. They understood the challenges of having a governance stakeholder group that could only think within, for example, a Western mindset. Because culture also comes into it. Right? Cultural variations, what's acceptable. And we talk about ethics.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's ethics? What's acceptable in one culture is completely unacceptable in another, right? I was reading, I'm not sure if you've been over to the Middle East, John. I'm sure you have.
Several times.
You're smiling, right? I was told something as a student, and I didn't really take it seriously. And I was reading, I had a stopover, unexpected stopover in Doha last weekend. And there were a couple of English gents on the flight, and they were rapidly reading up about cultural norms in Doha because their stopover was unexpected as well. We were all en route to Nairobi, and they were on the plane next to me, and they were like, do's and don'ts. And one of the do's and don'ts, it's nothing to do with AI.
Brilliant. What's this? I can't wait to hear this.
If you cross your legs, do not point your feet.
Your feet, I know.
At the person you're talking to, because with your foot points upwards, it's offensive.
And how realistic is that then?
Yeah, I mean, it's just...
It's not true. It might have been true 50, 60 years ago, but actually not. No.
Well, I was told that as a student, right? Because I was sitting with a Middle East gentleman. He goes, "You're being very rude," and I was like, didn't know what I was doing, right? But so, we're talking about these cultural variations, right? So we need a very diverse thinking across all elements of AI, and that does bring with it challenges. The challenge is not in terms of diversity of the model and the algorithm itself. We've talked about the need for diversity of data, but diversity in the governance group.
Okay.
Because we need to look at the output of the data. Now, if the output of the data is only being reviewed by a small subset of society, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
John, Tahir, it looks good to me.
Yeah.
Right. So we need, diverse thinking and diverse stakeholders to look at what we're trying to achieve, and to crucially always look at the outputs, right? Preferably before it's deployed, right? Go through the various, strategies, the various phases of strategy, design, testing, readiness,
testing, sampling,
right? And then we deploy, but you constantly monitor throughout the life cycle to ensure that the output is aligned to the actual use case and the KPIs that were decided at the point for that business case. Because
Sorry to interrupt there. I was going to say, but you said continue to constantly monitor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's quite a task, though, isn't it, to be able to do that?
Absolutely.
And how do you do that?
Well, I mean, look, technology definitely here is your friend throughout.
So in terms of automating.
Yeah.
Right.
Technology here is definitely your friend in terms of the whole life cycle.
Okay.
Certain elements in terms of, the human guardrails should never be removed. But we can look at everything from, firstly, what the knowledge of the data itself. Well, I mean, one of the main challenges that, again, I'm only going to use the big pharma example here, was they'd already deployed thousands of models.
Right.
And I said, do you have an inventory? They went, no. So we're now trying to govern something that we don't know about.
Didn't know what the contents.
No, they simply deployed before any kind of governance. Because it was...
Because there was a rush to get it done.
Yeah, it was, pharmaceutical lifestyle companies, as banking has deployed AI for a long time. But there was no requirement for governance. So they designed the models, they tested the models, deployed the models. But in terms of the output, the output in terms of harms to society, output met their requirements, but was it harmful? Was it trustworthy? Was it responsible? All these factors, right, were never considered. The data scientists merely considered their KPIs. So one of the first challenges for a large organization is, do you have an understanding across all of your assets of the AI that you've deployed and your shadow AI assets? In other words, how many of your staff have downloaded Gemini, have downloaded ChatGPT, have downloaded Copilot or DeepSeek, any of the hundreds of different models out there? Of course, they've downloaded them for a reason. They've downloaded your staff and colleagues have downloaded them to be more productive. But you don't know about them, and this is all about then risks. You can't govern what you don't know.
Sure.
I'm going to use a phrase that you're going to be familiar with, so I want you to shout it out. Right? I'm going to call it out. Unknown unknowns.
Ah, my goodness me. Yes.
Right, there we go. Right.
Yes, Rumsfeld.
I always use that. This unknown. So use technology, right, that can identify your AI and your shadow AI assets, and then can put them into an inventory for you. That's your starting point in terms of starting to understand what AI you have. Of course, you can still build out. Don't stop your governance process. Just say, well, we don't know what we have at the moment, Tahir, so therefore we shouldn't start. No, your governance process, your governance teams should start collaborating and communicating. It could be a team, it could be a working group, it could be a steering committee, it could be a defined group of individuals that have been given that roles and responsibilities. It's of course double hatting as well, right? So, but understand your AI, your shadow AI assets. Then you can utilize technology in terms of the data. One of the main challenges we have, John, is in the rush. Again, it's the rush, the word you used, to design, develop, deploy AI. Huge amounts of data are being ingested, which the model needs. But therein lies the challenges. This data contains everything. Trade secrets, confidential information that's pertaining to the individual, data privacy, right? Healthcare information. We don't know what the data is. If the onus is put onto the data privacy teams, my overworked colleagues who are trying to evaluate these data sets, running into tens of thousands of rows and columns. Frankly, that's going to lead to many challenges. First, one of time. A team of 3 to 5 trying to evaluate. And these data sets, John, are per use case. It's not one data set for all. Because again, if you use it's the right type of data for the use case. Not just one model, one data set for everything. Everything has to be aligned to the use case that's being given to you by the business unit. So my friends and colleagues are being given these huge data sets to effectively fast track and approve. You can't even begin to understand the challenges of that, right? And of course, under pressure.
Of course.
You have to, we're already behind schedule. Our competitors are ahead of us. So trying to understand the data, right, in a very narrow time frame, under pressure from leadership, under pressure from your business unit, of course, that may lead, and it does lead to data sets being incorrectly
corrupted, essentially.
Incorrectly pre-approved, right? Again, you utilize technology to understand your data.
And
understand the data you have in terms of your data discovery. Move on to your data classification. From your classification, understand what's sensitive, what's confidential. All of that is then classified. Get the context of that data, because discovery is great. Classification, the context is what you need. The context is what my colleagues across all these stakeholder groups require. They need to understand what the data means and the risks of that data. And that context could be in terms of there's a large amount of healthcare data here in this data set. But this data set is going for marketing for a new, for a new campaign, for a new pair of shoes.
Of course,
right? It's a footwear manufacturer. Yes, you may argue, well, actually, if there's some healthcare data that's pertinent to that, but again, we need to know what it is. We need to, as a privacy professional, I want to be led by intelligence. The days of 2016 to 2020, where we simply were given a spreadsheet of the kind of data we had, and we had to make sense of it, are gone. We need, again, we're going to use AI to automate and to enable this whole life cycle.
And do you think you mentioned earlier, and you've touched on it several times, about leadership and stakeholder buy-in and that? What needs to be done? I mean, clearly at the early stages of a deployment of an LLM within an organization who perhaps develop their own, what are the sort of leadership stakeholders? What's the advice? What's your advice to them? What needs to be done?
Well, empower your teams. Empower your teams. Give them the resources they need, and those resources could be upskilling. Right? I mean, again, I'm very fortunate. I train a lot of data privacy professionals globally under my role as the AIGP trainer. So there's about 15,000 of my colleagues that we've trained so far. Okay. Of course, with that course comes a certain requirement, a certain budget. Right? But equally, if you've brought in a wide stakeholder group, set aside some time for them to focus on the actual activities at hand, as opposed to you'll do all of your 9 till 6, plus you'll find time for this steering committee group, and you'll identify the risks, and you'll work out where any of this is either bias or discriminatory or unrepresentative or unproportional or or unethical, right? So empower your teams, give them the skill sets they need. Define roles and responsibilities. Many are responsible, one is accountable. Who is the accountable individual, right? Define that. Always champion the cause. We know that organizations are utilizing AI. You will benefit from AI, definitely. I am pro-innovation, John. Pro-innovation in terms of AI. So long as we have these guardrails in place. And for those guardrails, we need support from leadership.
Okay.
Don't just leave it to your team to work it out. Give them some kind of empowerment, some kind of resources, training, upskilling.
And it's interesting you mentioned innovation. So I think it was last year, the previous Prime Minister chaired an AI summit.
Bletchley.
And I think at the time there was a lot made of his interview with Elon Musk. In the US, of course, we've seen a change of administration. A few weeks ago, the VP was in the UK, I think it was the VP, or in Munich, actually, the Munich Security Conference, and was talking about innovation and the essentially governance around AI stifling innovation. Now, you mentioned there you're pro-innovation. I'm sure they'd be delighted to hear that. But that's caused a little bit of a uncertainty, I guess. And I'd be fascinated to hear your perspective on, what are the areas, what are the risks, and what are the challenges that this, I guess, different approach necessarily introduces?
It was. I think it was in. It was in February at the Paris Action Summit and Vice President J.D. Vance. And, the expectation was that, the EU AI Act would have the Brussels effect.
Yes.
It would have the same effect globally as GDPR. And of course, it's a new administration. And one of the first actions of the current president was to revoke all of the previous executive orders from President Biden. And President Biden had a really excellent executive order on AI governance and oversight. That included, one of the elements was red teaming to ensure that all elements of society were included.
Okay.
So if any US agencies were going to deploy AI, think about designing AI, they had to get input from wider society.
Okay.
Right. Now, of course, that's no longer here. But so, what does regulation give us? Regulation gives us certainty in terms of what we can and can't do. That's the benefits of regulations, because organizations need to invest with certainty. Venture capitalists, private equity, all these funds want to invest in an area that has certainty. And that's what regulation gives us. That's the benefits of regulation. You know what you have to do. But of course, sometimes you get to a state of over-regulation, and the current administration from the US is saying we're stifling innovation by having too much guardrails or too much rules.
Much red tape.
Yeah, too much red tape around that. And I can understand that approach.
Okay.
Definitely. So where does that leave us? Well, within Europe, we still have the EU AI Act. But of course, the immediate effect of that, John, was there was the EU AI liability directive that was dropped the next week. And that was to give rights and financial recompense to European stakeholders in the event that something untoward occurred as a result of using AI. Right? In other words, if AI goes wrong, you can go to the courts, and the burden of proof was significantly reduced, right, in order for you to get your compensation. That was, I think it was a result of President Macron said that he could no longer sign up this. So the ramifications were immediate in terms of now this liability directive complemented the EU AI Act, right, in terms of the fines and penalties. The EU AI Act is still there. It's still relevant to all of us within the EU. Now, of course, the UK. It's interesting that you mentioned the former Prime Minister Sunak. Yes, he wanted the UK to be at the forefront of AI and specifically responsibility, ethics, and trustworthiness. And this was further amplified at the G20 and at the Seoul Summit as well. The same words, same kind of wording was amplified. Now the UK has taken a much more pro-innovation approach. Of course, as you said, we've got new leadership now under Prime Minister Starmer. The approach is pro-innovation. Now, we can innovate, absolutely. But then we have to decide, how do we put in place the guardrails, and who will who would those gatekeepers be? And there was a conference in London just a month or so ago. I was very fortunate to be on a panel with policymakers and experts in the domain. And the conclusion was, if there's no regulation, then it must fall upon us as privacy professionals, because we've implemented privacy, but privacy is about trust. Privacy is not a means to an end. It's the differentiator for the organization, because we're aligned to the rights and the freedoms of data subjects. So if there's no regulation, it's myself or my colleagues globally that will take on that role of non-regulated gatekeepers, just to highlight the concerns that we have in terms of AI deployment. Yes, we know there's no regulations, but has the organization considered these impacts, the outputs, and the possible consequences to society, groups?
So essentially what you're talking about is introducing best practice, I'm assuming.
Yeah, best practices. Yeah, so if there's no regulations, but of course best practices by a group of individuals that know what the downside and what the risks are, right? And that's absolutely fine because, we have the skill sets, we have the knowledge, we're pro-trust, we're pro-responsibility, we're aligned to our end stakeholders. And, of course, everything that we say as data privacy professionals is merely advisory. It's always up to leadership to decide yes or no. But our role is to advise, it's to consult leadership about this is the project, these are the potential risks, this is the mitigation that we suggest, and that mitigation may have a cost. It may be so expensive, John, that it'll say thank you, Tahir, for your advice, but we're choosing to move ahead anyway. And that's absolutely the case, right? It has to be a pragmatic approach.
Of course,
right?
yeah.
And that's the approach that, generally myself and a lot of my colleagues globally take, right? We're aligned to the organizational needs, right? We want to take an approach that allows the organization to do what they want to do. And so long as we get involved early, and this is what we're talking about best practices, and of course there's frameworks now that we can adopt. There's the ISO 42001, which is the AI management system framework. There's fantastic framework from NIST, the AI risk management framework with some great guidelines, and at least a dozen others that we can look at for best practices without regulation necessarily guiding us. Put in place, and the vast majority of organizations globally, large organizations, are already aligned to these standards. Be they ISO, be they NIST, be the IEEE ethical standards for coding. We can utilize these. We can spread the message. We can. We're also as a community of governance, risk, and compliance professionals. We're a very close-knit community. We share a lot of information, John, right? When one of my colleagues or peers globally develops either some new collaterals, often I'll see on LinkedIn, and it's shared free of charge. Phenomenal. One of our colleagues just 3 weeks ago did a cross-mapping exercise that must have taken him months. Cross-mapped 7 different frameworks together with 2 different regulations, and it's all open source and free of charge. So our global community can now take that back to the organizations. Right, this is the mapping. This is how it all works. This is literally 2 to 6 months worth of work that can be taken back to the organization and shown, right, we're aligned to this framework. This is the regulation that that affects us, for example, in Europe, EU AI Act, right? Or we're doing business in China, right? What are opportunities and risks there? Right? So we're a very sharing and caring community, as you can tell from me, John.
Of course, I can. You're very sharing and caring looking. Interesting. You mentioned about Europe and then China. And, how do organisations cope with the myriad of regional variances that there are in data privacy, in data governance? In the US, of course, you've got interstate differences as well, haven't you?
Really difficult.
Yeah. So, what do you do? Is it presumably through using technology is the best way where you can automate this process, is it? Or what would you suggest?
It's a combination of people, process, technology, John, to utilize the old sort of triad there. From the people perspective, where you've got, global regulations, yes, the technology can assist you there in identifying what those regulations are, but you really need a trained professional. Now, I'm not a lawyer by profession, so whenever I have these challenges, I always go to my colleagues, my legal colleagues, be it internal or external, general counsel, and undertake an applicability assessment. Very, very important that you understand what are the applicable laws and regulations. And here, John, it's not just at the country level, it's the sectoral level. For example, there's global sectoral regulations on banking, on insurance, on healthcare, right? Then we go into the actual products themselves. So we have national, we have international, we have sectoral, and the products themselves, each of which may have different regulations. That's why with my limited knowledge of the law, I can tell you what the laws are of the land, but I couldn't do that applicability assessment. Now you've identified what laws apply to your organization across all of your different business units and globe. Then you can start to take that information and feed it into the right kind of technology.
Yeah.
Right. And with that technology, start to understand that if it's about data, start to understand your international data flows. Right. Where are your assets internationally? What are all your assets? Understanding all of your assets, be they on-prem, be on multi-cloud. Understanding where your assets are, and then within those assets, what are the information assets that reside? And then from those information assets, what are the risks? And then how do those assets flow internationally? So you can see, hold on, from this data map, we seem to have some data flowing in from India. We don't actually do any business in India, so that's interesting.
Where's that coming from?
Let's just click into that one line. Oh, we didn't know. Again, it comes down to the unknown. We didn't know that this data flow, because we have a processor out there, or we had some information flow out there. We didn't know that this data was going there. We didn't know this kind of data assets were there. These kind of data elements were flowing to and fro from that region.
Right.
No one informed us of the risks. And then with those risks, if you have the right kind of technology, it can tell you actually with this kind of risks, this is the potential regulations that you are now falling under, right? So this line, these are the potential risks of this data flowing to and fro, right?
Yeah.
And again, you can feed that in from your legal teams. You can build upon the current regulatory frameworks within the technology. What you really want is technology that's AI driven, but also with a large degree of customization. You don't want fixed templates, because a fixed template will work for everyone.
It would be too constrained, wouldn't
everyone and no one.
Yeah.
Right? If you have if you're a fixed template only for one organization in one sector, and you try and use the same template, I mean, I often have clients, to hear you've got a great template for NIST, but actually our organization, we use a combination of NIST and best practices. Bespoke the template, bespoke it and utilize it for what works best for you. Take what you have out the box and bespoke it. And the same with all of your risk assessments. Ensure that if you're utilizing technology, that your risk matrix is the one that's being used, not an out of the box 3x3 or 5x5. It's the risks that are pertinent to you.
Of course, yeah.
Because the risks and the risks are not just per organization. AI risks often are often outside of existing risk tolerance. Nevertheless, leadership will give you the go-ahead to proceed. Because your traditional 5x5 will say, no, the risks are too high. But of course, the risks also come with opportunities. If the opportunities are greater than the risks, you simply onboard the risk, right? So you have to be able to have a flexible risk framework embedded within your technology that is not just at the group level, but at the individual sort of output level.
Regional level,
Yeah, the regional output will be product risk, so that the teams, the governance teams can understand the specific risks and not just the sort of general and the corporate level risks.
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, I mentioned earlier on, I think that I was talking to actually a CISO earlier of a company. It was a software company who has 28 operations around the world.
Yeah.
And at the moment, their sort of GRC framework is, steam driven, and it's a real challenge for them.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't believe that in this day and age, that with the myriad of automation that's available, that they weren't actually in this space now and using this. Because as you said earlier, you mentioned the dotted line out to India. I mean, there could be a whole host of other risks that they are introducing without necessarily knowing it. Surely, I mean, would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it's not unusual that this approach is taken. They get into a level of maturity, and it's one of those things. Well, it seems to work, so we're fine. But of course, the challenges will not go away. Right? You've built a mature manual framework, and that's fine. Absolutely fine. That's what the vast majority of us did during the early days of GDPR. We didn't have the availability of AI-driven automation technology. Like, give us all this information. We needed together with the context. But But of course, so, if this colleague of yours that you talked had built a relatively mature framework, of course, the challenge with that, John, is no organization is static, right?
No.
What's leading the world economy now is data. And there's all these cliches, the new oil, the new water, the new power, right? Whatever it may be, is we're moving very quickly. We're definitely at lost count. Is it the fourth or the fifth industrial revolution, John? You tell me.
I think it's the fourth industrial revolution.
The fourth industrial revolution, right? Yeah. Where things are changing almost monthly. If we go back to December last year, Jan this year, it was all about large language models, huge amounts of investment required, $100 million plus, huge amounts of data. And no, you couldn't possibly replicate the likes of OpenAI. And then I remember I was at a conference. I was at an AI conference invited by the government of Oman. DeepSeek had just been deployed. And that's all we talked about the new possibilities. Suddenly, disruption came in. So with all of these changes, what we need as a CISO is still a GRC professional, right? Yeah. Understanding we need technology to enable us. It's not to replace us.
No.
Human guardrails, the human element is always there, but to give us further intelligence in terms of what it is we're doing. The data, even knowledge of the data assets for your CISO colleague, data assets that are spread globally, on the cloud, on-prem, right? How are they secured? How are they configured? Right? Huge issues with misconfiguration. There's a new it's not a new buzzword, but for the CISO community, they're looking very carefully now at what's called data security posture management, and it's relatively mature within the Gartner framework as well. The sort of magic quadrants.
Yep.
And this is all about not just discovering or classifying your data, but it's understanding the vulnerabilities and the misconfigurations to your data assets. Right? To give you an example, you put something on the cloud, you think, well, surely the hyperscalers have got that covered. Well, the hyperscalers protect the cloud itself. They don't protect what you've put inside the cloud.
No.
Those are your security procedures, how you've hardened it, your controls. So trying to get that kind of granular knowledge is where you need technology to identify those vulnerabilities, those misconfigurations, and then give that information to the relevant stakeholders, be it CISOs, InfoSec, the IT team. So they can take the information and they can then evaluate. I don't like the approach taken by some technology, which is auto remediation. The decision should always be taken by the actual stakeholders themselves, because they need to. It's been identified. They need to assess, evaluate, and determine what the actual control should be.
Okay,
they're the experts in the domain,
rather than relying on the technology to do it for you.
Yeah, and I mean, because if it makes the wrong determination, they're going to put in place the wrong control, right? The team is already there, highly skilled team that's been with the organization for many, many years. They're very mature. They need the information. They need the context, and this is why DSPM now is certainly globally becoming much more utilized by the information security community.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. I guess the last one from me, really, in the interest of time.
Wow, time has flown, hasn't it?
It really has, hasn't it?
It's like 5 minutes.
It really does. It's fascinating. What does the future hold? What's next?
Oh, the future. Oh,
if you were to predict the future,
the challenges of the upcoming challenges for privacy and AI and security. Okay, well, the one challenge that the vast majority of us are aware of in the community is quantum computing, right?
Yep.
Now, John, you're a security professional, and now quantum with quantum computing at the moment, the stability of quantum computing at the very, because it has to be at or close to minus 273. It's very unstable. So it can do quantum computing for about 1.5 seconds. But our modern encryption is built around AES 256. And the prediction is around about 2033 to 2035 that quantum computing can crack all of modern encryption.
Yeah.
Now, John, with your background, I can assure you that governments around the world are already looking at technology in terms of to improve current encryption, both defensively, but also, of course, offensively. Offensively, what do I mean by that? And we're going slightly off piste here, but gathering all the information they can that's encrypted, that they have that they have no knowledge of, with the view to decrypting it in 10 years' time. Yeah. Right. Just mass data collection.
Okay.
We can't utilize it now, but give us 10, 15 years. So that's the proactive, and reactively, we now need to secure against the same kind of threat for us.
Right.
Now, of course, that's a huge challenge for all of us, because it also, with, of course, the world of AI, we'll move much closer to what's called, I think AGI is already moving forward at a very fast pace. AGI, when I started talking about it, which is artificial general intelligence, general AI that can mimic our level of intelligence, right? We're already very close to that. 3 years ago, we were told 2035. Each time Sam Altman makes an announcement, it seems to shorten by 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Elon Musk, I don't know what his current prediction is. Either he loves AI or he hates AI, depending on which shareholding he has. Who knows, right? If he's a shareholder, he loves it. If he's not, right? But the possibilities of artificial superintelligence, which is effectively, for those of that are watching that are my and your age, which is your kind of Terminator, which is completely independent AI that can think and act independently, make decisions with no human involvement, right? That will become very much a reality. So that's a risk, it's an opportunity. And therein lies our responsibility as the human guardrails. Yeah. As we approach that, how do we ensure that it's deployed in the manner that befits and benefits all of humanity?
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating area, isn't it? I mean, it really is, and I think it's indicative of the quality of the conversation that time has just flown by. So
honestly, you're looking at your watch. I didn't realize it'd been an hour.
Well, listen, mate. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much, John, for having me.
I look forward to the next one. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
We'll be in touch. All right,
thank you, John. Thank you.